Welcome to this tutorial, and in this tutorial I'll be showing you how I mixed the IDK Beat Remake by Wizkid featuring ZLATAN. So this is how the raw file sounds without any EQ or processing after I exported it just raw. So after processing and mastering, this was how it sounded. So I'll be walking you through how I did mix mine. Mind you, this is a different samples. So if you try to replicate this to a different sample, you might not get the same desired result. So the first thing you want to do is that definitely you want to have all your stems exported from the production. Then you want to bring them into your playlist. Then you want to arrange them so that you can identify them properly. Then you want to send them to your mixer or Studio One and some other DAW. It's easy to, once you drag things into the playlist, it's already routed to the mixer. On FL Studio, you have to do them manually. So I'll be going through how I process each sound one after the other so you can see. But before then, what I do is I put my mix generally on mono. Then I do what is called volume leveling. That means I balance the instrument to sound well without panning. Unfortunately, I won't be able to scatter some of the panning settings in this mix because it's going to take time if I want to start building it from the scratch again. Once you've kept all your mixer on mono, then you can balance it in relative to how important the instrument is in the mix. So what I did for this song is that, first of all, when I exported this file, I staged my export to be about minus 18 dB. That means each file, when it was exported, was written around minus 18 dB. So it's very important that you stage your instrument before you even start mixing. So one thing you observe about the mixer is that it's what we call box channel. You can see similar instruments like the shakers. I link them to the box so that I can do group processing on them. My key principle is that when I'm doing volume leveling, I always had the bass last because the bass eat a lot of headroom, which might not allow you to hear other instruments clearly before I switch off my mono tab and I turn it back to stereo. Lastly, this mix is already panned, in which I be leaving like this, but just has to be at the center. Starting from my shaker bus, I'm going to be showing you what I did. On my shaker bus, before the effect came in, it sounded like this. After the effect came in, it sounded like this. So what I did on my shaker bus, I didn't do much because one thing I try as much as possible to do is to use good sounds from the onset. So what I just did here is to do a low cut to about 156 Hz because other things below that to me weren't necessary. And I did the processing for two of them like that, just together. So that's one good thing about bus. So moving on to the snare, I had about 6 snare because the song itself, there was nothing much going inside the song. So I needed a full snare just to complement it and maybe get the desired sound I wanted to hear. If I switch on the effect, it sounds like this. With the effect on, it sounds this way. Okay, so for the EQ, I didn't really do much on the EQ. Note that I did not use the exact point. I only just took a point, boosted it up, added a gain, then I adjust the Q, then sweep it left to right. You can actually sweep with the frequency here, or I sweep with by clicking on it. Then whenever I hear something that I don't like, I bring it down. So the frequency is the pitch or tone. The gain is the amount of boost or amount of cut you want to apply. I believe you all know this. While Q factor determines the width of the frequency band affected by the EQ. For this snare bus, what I did is that I did a cut about 1.64 kilohertz. So if I'm to exaggerate that frequency, it sounds like this. So I didn't actually like what I was hearing there. So I did a cut there. I did another cut about 3.03 kilohertz. So let me exaggerate that frequency. So I didn't really like that sound. So I did cut it out. So I did another cut about 6.09 kilohertz. So let me exaggerate that. It sounds like this. So I didn't like that. So I just did a cut there about -1 dB also. So I did a slight boost at the high end about 11.35 kilohertz, and I did a boost about 1.9 dB just to boost the snare. So it sounded like this without the EQ. With the EQ, it sounds like this. So another thing I added was the compressor. For the compressor, basic compressor, the threshold, we all know that the threshold is the level at which the compression begins to take effect. That's when the compressor becomes active, while the ratio determines the degree of compression that applies. What ratio 1 means, for every 4 decibel, the input signal exceeds the threshold, the output will only be 1. So the attack is just the time it takes for the compressor to respond and apply after the input signal exceed the thresholds. While the release is the time it takes for the compressor to stop compressing after the input signals fall below the threshold. So a longer release time can smooth out the overall level. So yeah, I set the threshold to about 3, then 2:1, slight compression, and I set the attack to about 11.2 milliseconds because I want the initial transit to actually go through, while I set the release time to about 12.3. This is based on preference. So what I do basically sometimes is that I exaggerate the attack, then I bring it down to where I feel it sounds okay for me. Lastly, the makeup gain is just to bring the original sound level to the initial sound level before compression. The snare burst without compression sounds like this. With compression, it sounds this way. So if you notice the difference is the snare is popping out much more better. So the last thing I added to this snare was this smart attack. So what I did is that I loaded this smart attack, increased the attack to about 19, then I reduced the sustain to about -15. So without the smart attack, it sounds this way. With the smart attack, it sounds this way. You can hear how it's attacking much more better. So that was what I did for the snare burst processing. So the next thing I had here was this rim burst. And the rim burst without the effect on sounded this way. The effect on it sounds this way. So what I did for this rim burst was quite simple. I actually just picked out the snare burst settings and I threw it to the rim burst straight up. Why I did this was because I wanted the rim and the snare to sound so close in the mix. So that's why I just threw it here. So I used the same compressor, but the only thing I removed was the smart attack. I didn't use the smart attack here. Next one was the kick. So the kick without effect sounded like this. With effect, it sounds this way. So you could see the difference. So for the kick, I did a low cut about 30 hertz, you understand, just to cut out those muddy or irrelevant frequency from the kick. So about 204 hertz, I did a cut about -179 dB. So let me exaggerate that so you hear that. So I didn't like that, so I did just cut that out. At 2.53 kilohertz, I also did a slight cut about -0.99 dB. So let me exaggerate that. It sounds like, so I didn't like that particular knock or funny frequency there, so I removed that. So about 500 hertz, I did a cut about -1.79 dB. Let me exaggerate it. So you could hear that annoying sound. I did that. So I removed that. So lastly, what I did for this particular kick, I needed some brightness in the kick. So I boosted about 2.18 dB, about 5.59 kilo hertz, just like you can see here. So that's what I did with the kick, and it sounded this way. Without effect, with effect. So the next thing I added was this saturation. I always put saturation on my kick, but for this kick, I use heavy saturation. But you want to be careful with this drive so you don't drive it too much. So without saturation, it sounds like this. With the saturation, so you could see that the kick is coming up. Lastly, I added a compressor. So what I did was to set the threshold about -20 dB. So this means that once the kick exceeds that 20 dB, there will be a compression about 2:1. That means for every 2 dB, it's only 1 dB that will be outputted. So Without the compressor, it sounds like this. With the compressor, it sounds like this. So for the attack, I gave it more attack, about 7.11 milliseconds. And the reason is that I wanted many of the transient from this kick to pop out from the mix because the kick is very, very keen. I dropped the release to about 6.19 milliseconds. So the next thing I did was this smart attack. I didn't mess around with the sustain here. I only just boosted the attacks. So without the smart attack, it sounds like this. With the smart attack, it sounds this way. So one thing you want to try as much as possible to do is to pay attention to the original sound and see that what you're adding is actually just boosting, not that it's changing the total sound generally or making it worse. So the next thing I had here was this bass boss. Now for the bass boss, without the effect, it sounds like this. So with the effect, it sounds this way. So let me go through the effect channel. Now for these bars, what I did was I did a cut about 33.8 Hz. About 349 Hz, I did a cut about minus 0.99 dB. So I wasn't liking what I was hearing there. And see how terrible that is. Also about 180 Hz, I did another cut about minus 0.9 dB. To exaggerate that, it sounds this way. So I didn't like that. I just did a slight cut. Note the reason why I'm doing a slight cut around this point is because that's where most of the fundamental frequency of the bass lie. So I don't want to really mess too much with that area. And lastly, about 1.94 kilohertz, I did a boost about 2.79 dB to give that bass the brightness because of the type of song. So it sounds like this. So if I'm to switch off that part, it sounds this way. So if I want the boost back, it sounds like this. So you can see how the bass is coming alive. So the next thing I did was to add this saturation plugin. Without the saturation, it sounds like this. With the saturation, it sounds this way. So here I use the one thing. If it were to be a log drum, I'll be using the FV saturation just to give it that punch well. So the next thing I did was this compressor. So what I did was that I adjust the threshold to a point where the compressor starts working. Then I adjusted my attack and the release time. So the next thing I did was to add another compressor. This time around, the compressor was sidechaining to the kick. So let me switch on the kick. So the bass and the kick without the sidechain sounds this way. With the sidechain on, they sound this way. Titanium just makes the kick and the bass glued together. So what I did was I set the threshold to about 25.12 dB. And you can see I'm using just 2:1. Then my attack, I did mess around with the attack a little bit to about 3.85 milliseconds and the release to 24.3. Because after the two compressor, I noticed that there was a drop in the bass. So I did a makeup gain to about 1.2 dB to get the bass to that initial decibel. Moving on to the next thing, which was this sub bass. So for the sub bass, it sounds like this without effect. So I believe you can hear that. Then with the effect on, it sounds this way. So bass, I didn't do much. All I did was to add a low cut about 22 Hz. And on the compressor, what I did was I had a compressor to compress those peaks. Let me exaggerate it a bit. Without the compressor, it sounds like this. So you can hear that peak there. So with the compressor, it sounds like this. So you must actually always know what your compressor is doing in the mix. Try as much as possible to keep my gain reduction about minus 3 dB. Also, I kept the attack about 3.85 milliseconds, where the transient is enough to go through. And I adjusted the release to about 24.3 milliseconds. You want to be careful with the attack and release because it could mess up your sound. And I did a makeup gain about 1.2 dB. The next thing was this O. So if I'm to solo the O without effect, it sounds like I kept a stereo imager just to make it wider, and it sounds like this. So the other effects you are hearing on the whole is the reverb and delay, which I'll be coming to that later. So the next thing was this hit. The hit alone without effect sounds like this. So for this hit, I just kept a EQ and I did a low cut about 50.5 hertz. As simple as that. The next one was this lick here, and the lick alone sounds like this without effect. And with effect on, it sounds this way. What I did for that lick was that I did a low cut to about 320 hertz because I didn't need every other information there. So without the EQ, it sounds like this. With the EQ, it sounds this way. Then I added a stereo imager just to make it wide, as simple as that. That was what I did for the lick there. So for the chop here that we have here, and this chop was extracted from Wizkid, the original song. So what I did there was just add EQ because that was already a mixed work already. So I added the EQ. So it sounds like this without EQ. With the EQ on, it sounds like this. So what I did was I did a low cut to about 88.7 hertz, and I actually reduced the high end here. So that was what I did there, about 10.73 kilohertz down. So the next thing was this piano sound. So for the piano sound, it sounds like this without effect on. So with the effect on, it sounds this way. So for the piano, I noticed some dirty frequencies I needed to take out. So I did cut to about 80.0 hertz. You could go further, but because it was an E-piano, the depth mattered in the song. I did a cut about 651 hertz. So if I boost it up, that frequency sounds like this. So I didn't like that, so I just did a cut there. So also at 300 hertz, I did a cut there. It sounds like this. Boosted, then I just did just to clear out that piano. Lastly, I did a compressor because I noticed some part the piano was really going too loud. So I did a compressor just to compress it a bit. So first thing I do is that for the compressor, it was first of all about 2:1. Then I turned it to 3 because it wasn't really compressing it the way I want. So for the attack, I set it to about 2.74. The release is set to about 25.3 because this is a piano sound. So it sounds like this without the compressor. So with the compressor, it sounds this way. Then the next thing was this pad. I did a group processing for my pads. Yeah, so it sounded like this without the effects. So with the effect on, it sounds this way. So what I did was very, very simple. I added an EQ and I did a low cut about 90 hertz. Then about 384 hertz, I did a cut about minus 1.19 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So you could hear a lot of muddy frequency going there. I did a slight cut about minus 1.19 dB. I did a cut there. Let me exaggerate it. For me, I didn't really like what I was hearing there. So I just did a slight cut. And if you notice, I'm not really doing much on this because everything goes into using the proper sound. You're playing your pad and you're using too much notes, you will have problem when you want to EQ it because you'll be hearing a lot of muddy frequency. So you have to be careful when using your pad sound. So lastly, for the pad, I added a stereo imager just to make it wider. Without the stereo imager, it sounds like this. With the imager, it sounds like this. Just to make it wider and create more space. Moving to the trumpet sound, The trumpet sounds like this without effect. With effect, it sounds this way. So for this trumpet, what I did was quite simple. I did a cut about 251 hertz because I didn't need any other thing down there. So that's a low cut. Then about 2.79 kilohertz, I did a cut about 1.79 dB. So let me exaggerate that. So you could hear that whistle frequency. I just did cut it out like that. If you notice, I'm not really doing too much EQ. So I take time in getting the right sound. So I don't have to start EQing too much. Then the next thing I did was this stereo imager, which sounded like this without. With the imager sounds this way. So that's what I did for the trumpet. Now moving on to the reverb, I will switch on all the synths. So the reverb I use is this Vala reverb. And to get your reverb, go to Google, type reverb calculator, and to ask you for the BPM of your song, input the BPM and pick one of the template there. Is either large, most times I use large room. Then on my mode on this Vala reverb, I also use room. Then I set the mix to about 100% straight up because the reverb is working as send. Then I also set this 38 and 2.4 based on the information I get from the site for my large room settings. So that's what I do for my reverb basically. Then I had the EQ, and this EQ is to just cut out unnecessary frequencies that you don't want to be reverbed. So this EQ is to create section of the reverb you want to be heard in your mix. When you have too much of the high end, it tends to conflict with a lot in the mix and tend to affect the clarity of the mix. So this was the way I did this particular reverb. Now for my delay, I also use Vala delay. Now you will notice a gate on this Vala delay. The reason because of this was that this Vala delay, when it's not inputted any signal, there was this noise coming in from the delay. So I had to add gate to kill that noise when this plugin was on. So for my delay, I'm using this mode tape. And to get your settings, all you have to do is on that reverb calculator, if you go scroll down, you'll see your delay settings also, and you just input it accordingly. If you're using 104 notes, include the time and keep your mix as 100%. So once you've done that, this is what I did. On my shakers, I just sent the reverb, create send. So there's what we call pre and post. So this small icon here, I don't know for other DAWs, is for pre and post. So if you see pre fader and post fader. So for reverb and other effects, I use post. I'm doing parallel compression, I use pre. For reverb, it's not something you crave, it's based on preference. But for some instruments like shakers, you want them to have more reverb. For snare, kick, and all those key instruments like snare rims and bars, you want to keep the reverb as minimal as possible. For your Vox, you want to give it a lot of reverb and add delay. So for this O, it sounds like this with the reverb and delay on. So that's one thing there. So you want to add reverb and delay to your box like that. For this, I gave it a little reverb. The leaks here, I gave it more reverb because I want it to be lost in the mix a bit. So I sent it to the delay also so that it can give it a fuller feel. So for some of my synth sound, I use delay and reverb. So for this chop at the beginning, I just sent a reverb based on preference, piano, reverb, and the pad, I gave it reverb also. For this trumpet, I gave it a lot of reverb and also had a delay to it to make it sound the way it sounded. So let me solo it out so you hear the effect. I also had EQ to my delay. The mix sounds like it without the master effect on. So I have a good start point. So for my master, straight to the point, what I do is I had a pro multiband compressor. The reason for the multiband compressor is so that I can compress various sections of the mix separately. So for the multiband compressor, what I did was on the low end, I did a little compressor. For the low end, I did a slight compression. So moving to the mid section, I did a slight compression there. So it sounded like this. So on the high end, I did same thing. So everything sounds this way with the multiband compression on. Off. So I'll be toggling it now. So the next thing I had is my Reverb plugin, ARTG Mastering Live Stereo. So yeah, I just kept it on the modern about 3, and I just increased the ratio till I was getting about -3 to about -5 here on this meter. So let me switch it. So let me switch it off. On. So what you want to do with this plugin, most times I use modern, but sometimes I switch to ordinary. So you can mess around it to see the one that gives you the desired sound you want. Lastly is this spreader. This spreader is key. I use it to spread the mix. For this particular song, I kept it about -4. Now the next thing was this stereo imager. I know it's weird, but I used it to just very slightly just to make the mix wider. So without it on, it sounds like this. With it on, it sounds this way. Then the last one on the list is this ozone maximizer. Now, the first thing is I set the ceiling to about -0.2 dB. So the master is so that the mix is not clipping. So without it on, it sounds like this. With it on, you want to turn your volume down a bit because I want to session the master. So it sounds like this. The ozone maximizer on, it sounds like this. So what I do for my threshold is that I set my threshold till I'm hitting about 10 or 11 LUFS. Remember that there's no vocals on this beat, so you want to give room when vocals come in so that it still sounds well. So this is it now. You can see I'm hitting about 10, 11. So that's how I actually mix this particular beat. So if you like this tutorial, subscribe for more.